Hi guys, and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. I'm Nick Thomas, and here to talk to you about a topic that comes up fairly often online that leads to a fair bit of confusion and misunderstanding, and it can be a little bit frustrating, and that is when people sort of ask the question, is that a 1796? Or they say, is that a 1796? And automatically, what they're referring to is this, is a 1796 Trooper's Sabre, and it's one of the most iconic British swords that was ever made. So it's not so surprising, it gets talked about a lot, but the problem is that whenever people see a well-curved sabre with some kind of stirrup on there, they just say, is it a 1796? Now that is problematic for two core reasons. The first one is easy and the second one requires a little bit more explanation. So the first one, the easy bit, 1796 was a year that had massive overhaul of swords and regulation specifically of swords in the British Army. So they had just about been some regulations before then, but 1796 was the big year where a lot of new patterns came in, standardized, and kind of led the way forward for the future. Now the 1796 Light Cavalry Trooper is just one of those. So when you say is something a 1796, well, there's the Trooper Light Cav, Officers Light Cav, there's the Heavy Cavalry Swords, which are a form of backsword, broadsword, or palash, depending on which terminology you use. There's the Officers' versions of those. There's the Heavy Cav Undress or Dismounted Sword, which is a form of spadroon. There's the 1796 NCO Sword, which is a spadroon. The Officer's version, which is a spadroon. There are Horse Guard swords. There's a variety, okay? So most of the patterns that were in use in the Napoleonic period came in 1796. There's a couple of exceptions, but most of them came in 1796. When you say 1796, you're talking about almost every type of sword, infantry and cavalry that was used in the Napoleonic period. So that's why using the term 1796 is just not very helpful. Now, that's the easy bit. Next bit, if you see a sabre and say 1796, that makes a bit more sense because, yeah, there was only one 1796 light cavalry sabre, although there is the officer version, but it makes a bit more sense to just refer to, when you're talking about sabres to 1796, people know what you mean. Okay, but there's still an awful lot of problems with that. And partly it's to do with the fact that there's the Troopers version and there's the Officers version, and the Troopers, they tend to be pretty consistent and they run about 900 gram weight range. The blades only vary a little bit. The rough handling tends to be pretty well consistent. So when you talk about a 1796 light cavalry Troopers sabre, anybody that's handled them has a damn good idea of what you're talking about, and that's fine. But there are then the Officers versions, and there are a lot of sabres at the time that were based on this kind of sword that actually handled nothing like them. And that's because they were used by yeomanry units, militia units. They were infantry officer swords were influenced by them, what was later called flank officer swords, which are your flank companies, which are your light infantry and your grenadiers. So there were a lot of swords that looked like this, but didn't really handle anything like it. And as such, you get a lot of confusion. So an example would be this Black Fencer sabre. Now, Black Fencer up until now have not made a steel light cavalry sabre. They've made a synthetic based off some specs I gave them. They didn't make a steel. So the only steel stirrup hilt they had was this one, 1796. And if you look on there, it says Infantry Sabre. And that is significant. This was never intended, because this was based on my stats provided by swords that I've owned, others that I've handled, and a lot of data I've collected. I gave them the data for this one, and we decided to call it 1796 Infantry because the overall pattern, the shape of it, the overall design, is that of the light cavalry trooper's sword. But it is not made to the specification in terms of weight and mass and length of a light cav. Now, the reason for that complexity, if you like, is because these didn't follow any kind of pattern. So when these sabres were first carried, they were carried against regulation, so officers just started carrying them because they liked them for fashion purposes, probably, maybe perceived improvements in combat capacity over some spadroons, although that's a way more complex subject and it's not entirely true, depends on the individual examples. So eventually when it did come in to official use for flank officers, it became the 1799 regulation, but there was no pattern. So it was just, flank officers can carry sabres without saying what kind of sabre. So they just kept following the 1796 LC style, but they were usually smaller, lighter, and faster, significantly so. So you could be justified in calling this a 1799 infantry sabre, but I didn't like that definition because there was no regulation of that whatsoever. So yeah, we've gone with the terminology of 1796 infantry because it follows the style of the 1796 pattern, but isn't actually a cavalry sabre. And often I've heard people handle these and say, oh yeah, but it handles nothing like my 1796 trooper's sword. Well, no, it doesn't, because it's not intended to be a 1796 trooper's sword. It is inspired by the trooper's sword and made to a much more agile and smaller infantry specification. And they carried on in use well after the official infantry regulations in 1803 came in as well. So there were all kinds of non-regulation and regimental types that were like this. Okay, and when I talk about how different they are, these are often around about 700 grams as opposed to the light cav, which are usually around 900. And all of the extra mass is realistically in the length and specifically the mass in the tip of the blade. And as you can imagine, they therefore don't handle anything like one another. So that gives you an idea of why calling something a 1796 sabre can be problematic, because people are always thinking of the LC, and in which case you should be saying 1796 LC, and then people will know what you mean. And don't get confused with the whole breadth of other swords that are of the same style, because a lot of yeomanry swords, a lot of officers' swords are loosely of this style, but can handle very, very differently. So as an example, here is a infantry sword that is, again, styled on the 1796 LC, but is significantly lighter and shorter. And again, this one is around about 700 grams. It's agile and fast and nothing like the fairly hefty light cav. So there you have it. When you talk about 1796s, define which one of them you mean, because there are a lot of them. And when you talk about 1796 sabres, don't think that they're all like the trooper's sword, because there is an immense variety. You can find swords that loosely look like this and are of the same period, contemporary to it, that are 600 grams and tiny. And you can get others that are 1 kilo brutes that are much bigger. So you'll find a whole range. So yes, when you talk about 1796 troopers' swords, we all know what is being discussed. But when you talk about 1796 or 1796 sabres, it's way, way more vague than that. So yeah, we need to just get a bit tighter down on terminology and realise that there's a huge number of swords used in this era for infantry and cavalry and others, because in the Navy they were using similar swords as well, so lots of naval officers bought swords that are similar to this. And there's a huge variety of swords that sort of look like it. They do follow the rough pattern of it, but don't match it for size or specification in terms of weight or mass distribution, even closely. And so there you have it. Don't assume that every 1796 is a light cavalry sword. And again, with Black Fencer, they have now just produced a 1796 light cav, but nobody's seen it yet because the first one is on its way to me in the post at the moment. So yeah, it has been made, but nobody's actually handled that one yet. So it's on the way. And in terms of how differently do these handle, well, vastly so. A light cav trooper is, because of all this mass and extra length in the blade, is balancing around about 18 centimeters, even up to 19 centimeters, sometimes even further. And a little infantry one like this is normally in the range of, 11 to 14 centimeters balance. So you're talking about something nimble and agile. Yeah, there you have it. Not all 1796s are sabres, and not all 1796 sabres are brutish trooper swords. And when I say brutish, I mean this is not actually a clumsy sword, but it is meaty. Anyway, hope I got the points across. Not all 1796s and not all 1796 sabres are trooper swords. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already.